Smith. It's open now.
Yes.
And he has graciously agreed to come and talk to you about what all is involved in what's going on in the museum itself. And so we're glad to have David Kennedy here.
I am the curator at the United States Marshals Museum, and I want to thank the library for inviting me to come up. As the spouse of a public librarian, I appreciate the role of libraries in our society as much as I appreciate the role of museums in our society, and it's part of what makes both of us enjoy working with these organizations and not necessarily looking forward to being very wealthy in our retirement. So we get to have a good time trying to help educate people about the topics that we do and do the services we take care of. Originally, Susan was supposed to do this presentation. Susan is our development vice president, and she is I guess our chief moneymaker, and she has a little bit different take on the museum than I have. But I will talk to you about the museum, who we are, how we got to where we are, and kind of a little bit about what it is. Has anyone here been to the museum before? Okay, I got one hand up over there. A little bit first about the Marshals, because a lot of people don't really recognize and don't really understand the role of the Marshals. They think the Marshals are tied to either the it's like True Grit and John Wayne, or they think that they might be something else out of movies, like Tommy Lee Jones doing The Fugitive or doing U.S. Marshals. But Marshals go all the way back to the founding of our country. They're the first federal law enforcement agency, and they were the very first thing, as much as we might say the Congress doesn't do anything, the very first thing the United States Senate did was they created a document called the Judiciary Act. The Judiciary Act did one major thing where the Constitution created the judiciary under Article 3. The Judiciary Act itself did what the Constitution said. It said, okay, Congress gets to figure out everything under the Supreme Court. So the Judiciary Act, it creates the whole concept of what we now know as our federal judiciary. All the district courts, here we're in the Western District of Arkansas, you go across the border and you're in the Eastern District of Oklahoma, you go up a little bit north, you're in the Western District of Missouri, and each of those different districts has two presidentially appointed officers, the United States Attorney and the United States Marshal. The Attorney is there to help prosecute any of those cases. The Marshal is there to enforce any orders or anything that comes out of the federal courts. So essentially, they're the teeth for the federal judicial system. And so the guy who's in the picture right here, this is a guy named Robert Forsyth. Robert Forsyth was a Revolutionary War veteran. He was known to George Washington. He's also one of the first 13 United States Marshals. They were appointed by George Washington, approved by the United States Senate. He was the Marshal for the District of Georgia. He also became the first federal officer to be killed in the line of duty. In 1794, he shows up to deliver a notice to appear to a man, just basically saying, I need you to show up at work sometime. That person, in return for that, shoots him through the door and kills him instantly. And so he becomes the first Marshal to be killed in the line of duty. Since then, 392 men and women have died in the line of duty to the office of United States Marshal. Just a couple of months ago, we lost 4 deputy marshal and 3 special deputies in North Carolina. And you might remember that it was a couple months back. But like I say, the Marshals' history is American history. There's no major event that's taken place in the history of the United States that the Marshals were not part of. As for our museum, it started out in the late 80s, knowing that the bicentennial of the Marshal Service was starting up. The Marshal Service started working with the Smithsonian to create a traveling exhibit. That traveling exhibit, called America's Star, went around to about 14 locations around the country before they realized they kind of wanted to set this up semi-permanently in a home. That home ended up being in Laramie, Wyoming, in the State Territorial Prison Museum. That organization did not do the things that they were supposed to do to maintain and improve that exhibit. And so you can see there in 2002, the Marshals Service, they retrieved that exhibit, they put it into storage, and then it sat in storage as they were trying to figure out where are we going to put a new museum. So after a few years thinking about what they wanted, they did a national search. And as a result of that national search, they ended up narrowing it down to a city in Virginia and Fort Smith, Arkansas. And everybody in DC was positive, oh, it's going to go in Virginia. It's got to go in Virginia. That's where the government is. That's where all the people are. It's got to go there. Then they showed up in Fort Smith, Arkansas. They were met by thousands of people. There was a parade. There were signs. There was a huge reception in one of the hotels. And when they got to part of the program where they asked people to stand up if you're descended from the marshal, dozens and dozens of people stood up. They were descendants of marshals. I've met people there in the area who were still descended from deputies who served under Parker. And then they asked, okay, now step up if you're a descendant of one of the people the marshals were going after. And you still have dozens and dozens more people stand up. So yeah, I was descendant of this guy, he got arrested, and sent to Detroit or Leavenworth or whatever. And so as a result of that, and that outpouring of support locally, the Marshal Service said, okay, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to pick Fort Smith, and now you get to January 2007. If anybody remembers what else was going on at about that same time, the day after the Marshals picked Fort Smith as a homeless museum, one of the largest manufacturing plants in Fort Smith closed, as they were moving their workforce elsewhere. You also have what happened in 2008. You have a huge financial collapse. And as you start going over the next few years, you end up seeing changes in tax code, reducing how much money somebody can claim for charitable donations. You have eventually another little bit of a recession going on. You have COVID kicks in. And so when people ask that, well, what took you guys so long to get open? Well, there's a little bit of all of this. But part of the thing that was going on at that same time is nobody at Fort Smith, it kind of fell on Fort Smith and the University of Arkansas Fort Smith to create the museum. Nobody in those organizations had built a museum before. And so they started up from scratch, they talked to people, they learned some things. Within a couple of years, they actually created a museum which I work for, as an independent nonprofit. And so the museum is there, like the museum that I work for, is there to create this museum to help tell the story. So as they started to work through all this, and the graphic here from this article, it does not show Dick O'Connell. It describes Dick O'Connell, U.S. Marshal of the Western District of Arkansas. That's not Dick, that's Claude LeGree. And just on the next page, when they show the rest of this part of the article, they have a picture of Dick credited as Claude LeGree, so they can get it out. If anybody around here knows Dick O'Connell, he lives up in this area. He's lived up in northwest Arkansas. He was a special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. If anybody remembers the bombing campaign against Walmart back in the 80s, Dick was an FBI agent who was investigating that. Eventually, he ended up getting named as the United States Marshal for the district. And Dick and Claude and a gentleman named Jim Spears, who lives here in Rogers. I'm sorry, he's in, he's up in Bentonville, I'm sorry. They were all, like those three guys together, are the reason why that museum's in Fort Smith. And this was the plan that we were originally looking at. And it's kind of this is what was developed in 2009, and we started really actively looking to build a museum. As we all know, once a plan starts to once you get engaged with the enemy, the plan has to change. So we ended up changing to a slightly different design. As much as some people have given us a hard time because that looks like a spaceship, when you look at it from above, it looks like a Marshal's badge. How many people here have seen the film High Noon? You guys need to see some movies. High Noon, at the very end of it, there's this scene as the hero of the story is giving up his position as the marshal, throws his badge down to the ground, and it sticks up with 3 points of that star sticking up out of the ground. That was what was thought up here. So you've got this point right here pointing off towards Oklahoma, you've got a point going north and south, and then on the east side of the building, you've got 2 points going down into the ground. If it's stuck in the dirt. And this right here, that statue we just had, is one of my favorite things in the world. This is called the Light Horseman. It's by a Cherokee artist. And this particular statue is not, a lot of people think it's Bass Reeves, they think it's a marshal. No, the Light Horse were the law enforcement for the different tribes. As much as people think the marshals were the only law enforcement in Oklahoma, the 5 tribes each have their own law enforcement, their own set of laws, their own judicial system. If it was a crime that was between 2 different tribal members, the tribal courts would take care of it. The Light Horsemen would go after them, they would find them, they'd take care of that. If it was a federal law from the United States government, or if it involved a U.S. citizen, then the marshals would be there to go and enforce that. So if it was either assault or murder involving a U.S. citizen as either the victim or the assailant, if it was somebody bringing in alcohol of some sort, because nobody was allowed to take alcohol into Indian territory. And so whether that was Indian or U.S. citizen, that was probably close to 75–80% of the charges that came out of eastern Oklahoma, what's now eastern Oklahoma, Indian territory. About 75–80% of those charges were related to alcohol. And by the way, the Light Horse, they ended up being one of the major reasons why the marshals were so successful. Imagine you're riding by yourself 100 miles into essentially no man's land. You don't know who the people are, you just have a vague description of somebody you're looking after. You ride into an area, you might know, oh, I know the Light Horse guy who lives over here in Chakota, or in Sallisaw, or in Talbot, or wherever. You go find that guy, say, hey, I'm looking for John Smith, he looks like this, he did this. Oh yeah, I know, he's with the Jenkins guys over there, let's see, you want to get those guys, let's all go together and get them. So they were a force multiplier, kind of like today's modern marshals task forces. If there's something that's going on where somebody needs help getting a bad guy, the marshals will team up with other agencies to go out and try and find those people. And this is part of this room right here, is Samuel M. Seacard Hall of Honor. This faces out across the river towards Oklahoma, and you can also see that statue from the window here. There's 392 names on this wall, and then a couple of computers that are right there. These are the men and women who gave their lives. And so, Robert Forsyth, I mentioned earlier, he's right about there. 1794 all the way up to within the last couple of months. We have those names. There's about a dozen names who are task force officers. There's a bunch of names who are deputies. Well, sorry, a bunch of names who are posse members. There's a couple of guards. There's some jailers. There's 9 United States Marshals, the ones who are presidentially appointed. The deputies then work underneath those guys. And so this is one of those reasons why we're here. There are more marshals who were killed riding out of the Fort Smith area than any other part of the country. There are more marshals who died within 50 miles of Muskogee than any other part of the country. There's more marshals buried in Oak Cemetery in Fort Smith than any other cemetery in the United States. And it's because of this history and the number of people who get invited to do this job and the mental image that a lot of people have of marshals riding out of Fort Smith, that this is sacred ground to the marshals. And that's part of why we were here. And then, so, a couple of the worst ones here. Going Snake, we had 8 killed that day. That was 1872 over north of Sallisaw. There's a whole crazy story all on its own. That just lots of wrong versions of it, and the version that we have, our scholarship in that has greatly corrected how a lot of people have interpreted it. 4 names are from 9/11, mostly from cancers that they developed. The marshals didn't lose anybody that day, but over the years following, the people who were serving on Ground Zero, and the marshals very definitely did not corner the market on this. Anybody who served at Ground Zero is at a much, much higher rate of cancer. Over COVID, from 2020 through 2023, 8 different court security officers. If you go to the federal courthouse down in Fayetteville, you'll walk in, you'll see men and women dark blue blazers, white shirt, gray slacks. They're court security officers. They'll be running the metal detectors, they'll be checking the video cameras inside, they'll be doing patrols outside the building. They are typically retired law enforcement, and not all, but mostly are retired law enforcement in a second career. They are specially deputized as deputy marshals while they're on the job. So as soon as they come on the job, in the building, and they're doing that job, they are treated like federal officers. And they are part of what allows the deputy marshals, who are full-time law enforcement, to go out and do their jobs. And then, as I mentioned, North Carolina, April 29th, there were 4 killed there. It was a deputy marshal and 3 task force officers. For the plan of the museum, we've got nearly 20,000 square feet of exhibits in one building, purpose-built for this function. We also have, right up here, about 4,000 square feet, half of which right now we are, and I'll show you a picture here in a bit. We're hosting a temporary exhibit from Cherokee Nation right now on the Cherokee Nation 3. But to get a little bit better view, because not everybody likes to see diagrams like that, this is an overhead shot of what the building was supposed to look like with your entry with the star. Keep in mind what that looks like. We'll see it again. We've got an area called the Be a Marshal, with a timeline and talking about the basic jobs, how they get their responsibilities. The Hub and Our Wagon Wheel, Campfire, Stories Under the Stars. We have 4 deputies from 4 periods of American history, telling stories, real stories, about different deputies. Doing the same thing that if you get 2 or 3 cops sitting together, what are they going to do? They're going to tell stories. You get 2 or 3 soldiers, you get 2 or 3 athletes sitting around. They're going to start telling stories. It's nothing different than what any of us are used to. And this area, though, it's a respite spot, it's a learning spot. If you get tired or a little bit overwhelmed seeing some of the stories elsewhere, you can sit and relax in a quiet place while you're listening to them tell stories. You have the Frontier Marshals, which is a lot of people we've talked to would have been really, really surprised because they thought the entire place was going to be the Old West. They thought everything in that building was going to be telling stories about Judge Parker. They thought everything was going to be cowboys with badges. They thought it was going to be horses and yeehaw and nothing about that. This is about, as you can see, this is about 20% of the floor space. We have A Changing Nation, which covers the entirety of our history, from the founding of the country all the way up to very, very recent history. We talk about everything from the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. We talk about the Civil Rights era. While we acknowledge the Civil Rights era and the role that the Marshals played then, we also refer back to the Fugitive Slave Act. Like I said earlier, the Marshals were the teeth of the federal judiciary. When Congress passes a law and the federal courts support that law, in this case the Fugitive Slave Act, who has to enforce it? At that time, the Marshals had to enforce it. So it's the same organization that in the 1850s had to return escaped enslaved people back to the South. 100 years later, they were enforcing the same, from the same courts. They were enforcing orders to integrate different schools, public schools, colleges across the South as well as in the North. The Marshals in the 70s and the 80s were in Louisville, Kentucky. They were in Boston, Massachusetts, doing the same thing. And then we have Modern Marshals, which is looking really at the last 50 years, because it's been a huge amount of change. It's been not just change in technology, in people, in the crimes, in the expansion of the mission, the role that the Marshals have played. And so we have a huge story to tell. In many cases, that one underlying story is how much the Marshals' role has permeated American history, but it's also because a lot of times the Marshals have to show up places they don't necessarily want to be. So here's our start. This is one of our favorite things, one of our favorite photo shops photo spots within the building. Just yesterday I escorted the new Portsmouth Marshals baseball team from it's a new college league that they're setting up. And we had them, toured them through, had a nice picture in front of this yesterday. You go into to be a marshal, and we have information about the founding documents, what gave them the right to do what they do. We talk about Article 3 of the Constitution. We talk about the Judiciary Act. We also have a timeline that runs from 1789 all the way to the present. We talk about major points within American history where the Marshals show up. We talk about the first Black U.S. Marshal. We talk about the first female U.S. Marshal. We talk about Going Snake. We talk about capturing Manuel Noriega, bringing him back to the United States. We talk about capturing El Chapo and bringing him back to the United States. Because it's really, especially over the last 50 years, what the Marshals have evolved to become is the premier fugitive hunting organization in the world. You get to the campfire scene, and so here's your four figures. I think I've got another picture. Yeah, but here's a shot from different angles just to get the scale. And these four figures, you have Robert Forsyth, Bass Reeves, Al Butler, and then I feel sorry for it, I never can remember her name. She's modeled on a modern female deputy who I believe finally retired about 3 years ago. But they're sitting there and they're telling stories from the turn of the 1800s, the mid-1800s, late 1800s, the 20th century, and the 21st century. Does anybody here remember during COVID sitting down on Netflix watching Tiger King? No? Okay. That's one of the stories that they talk about in there. Tiger King was this real just caricature of a guy over in Oklahoma. Netflix, he got Netflix famous during COVID, and he goes off to prison. Like he's got this basically he's got all these wild cats, tigers and lions, and he's breeding different things he shouldn't be breeding, and he breaking all kinds of laws. He goes to prison, leaves it with his friends taking care of it. They continue to break federal laws. Fish and Wildlife partners up with the Marshals. They go in and as part of the court order, again, back to a federal court, saying, okay, all of these cats have to go someplace else. So they work out where they're going to go, how they're going to get them out of there, and they had, I talked to these guys, they said it was the weirdest assignment they ever had. Like 2 or 3 days, they were transporting big cats out of cages, into trucks, and sending them off to other places elsewhere around the country. Just some of the crazy stories that Marshals get involved in. You can head from there off to the right into Frontier Marshals, go back over your left shoulder into A Changing Nation, back over your right shoulder into Modern Marshals. We talk about Bass Reeves. A lot has been made about Bass Reeves in the past. Did anybody here watch Lawman Bass Reeves? It was on Paramount Plus. Okay. Lawman Bass Reeves, a few of us had a little sit-down History versus Hollywood presentation a few months ago about that one. There's some factual stuff that goes on there. It is, just have to remember, it's fiction, written based on a fictional book, based on a fictional understanding of a real person. And so you've got like 3 degrees of separation. Probably, yes, there's some real stuff in there. Bass Reeves really existed. He did have a wife. Isaac Parker was there. He existed. There's a couple of other people who showed up who were real people. The way that Marshals did their job is almost entirely not right. Some of the stories about how certain things happened is almost entirely not right. But it's one of those things that as a historian, as a museum person, one of the things I appreciate that is if somebody watches that and they get really intrigued, what are they going to do? They're going to start looking up more information. They're going to try and find more history. They're going to hopefully at some point end up in a museum like mine or theirs and end up learning the real story about the people that they see on the television screen or in a book. We have, if nothing else, here in our Marshal's office, we do also, telling somebody earlier, one of the complaints that we get is they want to see more stuff. And typically it's people 5, 10, 15 years older than me, looks like this, and they're wanting to see guns and badges because, well, that's what you have in a police museum. Well, that would be great if we were a police museum, but for most of the cases that we're talking about, if I have nothing but guns and badges up there, how do we tell the story? How do we help you understand more about the people other than, well, they carry that kind of gun and wore that kind of a badge? And so we have a small selection of some of the different types of firearms that are right here. We try to use those to help do that, to try and explain a little bit about the progression of technology. But there's not a whole lot that really helps you understand about the jobs that they did, the people who did these jobs. Going Snake, I mentioned that. We have a small theater that tells the story of Going Snake in 3 parts. This guy's supposed to be Zeke Proctor, a Cherokee Indian who killed a Cherokee woman, and he was going to get tried for murder in a Cherokee court. The problem is the family of the woman didn't think that Zeke was going to get the full justice that they were wanting. And by them, they were wanting justice being a nice, swift trial, ending with a nice, swift drop on the road. And so they showed up in Fort Smith with the husband of this woman, who was a U.S. citizen. He shows up down in Fort Smith to swear out assault against a U.S. citizen because he was there with his wife. Zeke, by most accounts, was shooting at him, not Polly. And so they get that warrant sworn out, you send a posse up, and you get 2 deputies and about 8 posse members getting to go up and arrest Zeke Proctor. If they're giving the orders, if he's found guilty, let the Cherokee take care of him. If he's acquitted, take him back in, bring him down to Fort Smith, we'll try him. The problem is, this posse was also being accompanied by 5 members of Hollywood's family. The whole time, the deputy was trying to talk them down and try to say, hey, we've got a plan, this is what we're going to do. They're like, okay, fine, yeah, fine. Then they show up, walk into the schoolhouse where they're holding court, and the first thing that happens is one of those guys from Polly Beck's family immediately lowers a shotgun, fires a blast at Zeke Proctor. And that starts up about a 5-minute gun battle that results in the deaths of about 11 people. As far as we know, 11 people were killed, 11 people were wounded, as many as 40 or 50 people were involved in the gunfight. This is the biggest, bloodiest gunfight the United States has seen. And the end result on this, Zeke is injured, but he gets away. You end up with 8 members of the posse were killed. One of them being the lead deputy. 4 of them being members of the Beck family. The Beck family member who fired the first shot, he lived. He died of old age. You have the judge was injured. Zeke's brother was killed. Zeke's defense attorney was killed. So that same day, you have the largest loss of life in one event for the Cherokee Nation. And so it's just really crazy how all of that event happened. And for years, the whole thing was these bad marshals rode in the Cherokee Nation to take over and force their white man law on the nation. As a result of our research, and this has been us working hand in hand with Cherokee Nation and their historians, is this event, we finally understand that it was appropriate federal involvement with the side dish of a family feud between the Becks and the Proctors. And Cherokee Nation, they fully support everything you said. We also have, from this scene, if you look over to your left, you'll also see where you go in the Old West to tell stories, you go to a salon. So we have a salon. In the salon, we've got a poker table that has a trivia game set up as cards. We have a bartender back in behind the bar telling you stories from the Old West. And so you can sit there, you can go in, you can hear him tell stories, and it's a whole 3-dimensional thing. He's behind the bar, but then you realize that he's actually in the mirror behind the bar. But even further behind that, you've got where the stories are playing out in kind of a film version. There we go. So you've got the poker table, and it's one of the stories being told up there. We also talked, as I mentioned, about the Civil Rights era. We talked about how even though somebody might hold a certain belief in their heart and in their mind, if that belief goes against federal law, it still doesn't make it right for you to take action. So quite often the marshals end up having to get involved in that, where even the marshals themselves have acknowledged that there's a lot of guys I've talked to who were at New Orleans in 1960, or they were in Oxford, Mississippi at Ole Miss in 1962, who did not agree with what they were doing. But they all understood you put on the badge and do the job. You go out, if the court says this, if the law says this, you have to go out and enforce what the court and the law says. And so you have people who were escorting 3 young girls into McDonough 19 in New Orleans who were segregationists and didn't believe that those young girls should be going to that school. But they still did that job. They still made sure that those girls went in safely. On the back side of that, when I get into the 50s and the 60s, many events Martin Luther King was involved in, the marshals were there to protect him and his supporters. But then, years after the King assassination, Congress is holding an investigation into assassinations. Who is it that they call as a witness but the assassin of Martin Luther King? One of the jobs the marshals have is they have to escort and safeguard federal prisoners when they're being transported. One of the men who was one of the 4 deputies on that detail guarding him was at the time, a young black man. He's now no longer a young black man. He's a much older black man. Bobby Banks, a good friend of mine, one of my favorite people in the world. He grew up in D.C. He saw King speak. He saw the I Have a Dream speech. He went to fight as a Marine in Vietnam, came back home, became a police officer in Washington, D.C. A couple years after that, became a deputy U.S. Marshal. And as part of his duties, when the assassin of Martin Luther King came to D.C., who do you think was on that detail of 4 men? Bobby Banks. And during that whole time, I had the opportunity, one of my favorite conversations I've ever had was talking to Bobby about the events of that. When he had to sit and guard and save, and just keep safe this man who he had already, Bobby told me that King was his hero. He was the person that he wanted to emulate. And I was just asking, it's like, how did you do that? Like, how are you able to do that? Since I had to. I took an oath, I had the badge on, this is my job. He knew that if I had to, I would die for him. And he said that it galled the assassin just like nothing else. That every time the body walked in and played a food set in front of him, just because the guy was completely racist and a piece of trash. But it's one of those things that we get to talk about, some of these stories, to help people understand what it is the marshals have to go through to get their jobs done. Here's what we're talking about order. We talk about the Pentagon protests, we talk about labor disputes, we talk about standoff when you need. We even mentioned, we had a little bit of pushback from a couple of people when we were wanting to do this. We talked about the Portland riots to a certain extent, because the marshals were there safeguarding the federal courthouse. And they did not step off the property of the courthouse to defend it, but they were right there at the doorway of the federal courthouse. And we go through and we talk about those stories and we explain what it is and why. And as much as some people may not like it, and they may not, there's a couple of ways that people refer to cops during that time frame, which I get and I understand in many, many ways. We have to explain why the marshals are there and why they do what they do. We talk in Modern Marshals about how the marshals have changed. This is one of the most important pieces in our collection. It's a pair of handcuffs put on a guy named Christopher Boyce. Anybody here ever read the book or see the movie Falcon and the Snowman? Okay, 1980s, a couple of guys working for, I think it was Westinghouse. They were sitting in a room that was receiving telex communications from around the world for the U.S. government. They were in a little secret room. They could do whatever they wanted, and these were all secrets. They would take them in one machine, put them out on another machine. And it's one point, one of these guys realized, oh, we can make a lot of money by selling all this stuff that comes through here. They get caught later and indicted as Russian spies. They go to prison. Christopher Boyce ends up breaking out of Lompoc prison in California. He goes on the run. At this point, he's a federal fugitive. FBI doesn't care because, well, they've already arrested him once and put him in prison where he belongs. It's not their problem. It's somebody else's problem. This is where the marshals really start to get their definition as fugitive hunters. They start going after Christopher Boyce. They end up finding him up in Pacific Northwest in Washington State. After they arrest him, everybody finally realizes, oh, we need somebody to do this actively and take this on, and the marshals end up becoming the premier fugitive hunters. That's why there's a film that when they do remake The Fugitive, very specifically as a WS Marshal going after them. You've got the basis behind U.S. Marshals. You've got an actual Fugitive Hunters TV series with a fugitive unit from New Jersey. So you get a lot of this going on. We even have our 15 Most Wanted. The day that we put that up, they caught one of the guys on there. The next morning, we walk into work, we have to print up a new picture and slip it up in there. About half a dozen of people on there have been caught. We've gone back through and had to replace a bunch of them over time. We also, in the same space back behind me, we've got part of the stuff from 1985, Washington, D.C. The Marshals went in and had the what we refer to as the Redskins raid or the chicken raid, where they had fake Redskins tickets in Washington, D.C., and they ended up arresting more than 100 guys who thought they were getting free Redskins tickets. And for those of us who are old enough to remember the 1980s, back when the Redskins were actually a good football team, and still called the Redskins, that was the ticket. And so a bunch of these guys went in, they ended up getting captured. We've got all the information about that. My favorite spot, one of my favorite spots, in their own voices, it is right now currently more than 100, and hopefully by the end of this year I'll have more than 150 short interviews with people like Bobby Banks, telling these stories in first person as the oral histories, telling the real stories that the only editing we do in those is I have to obviously put them down to a minute and a half or 3 minutes. And there's a couple of them where the language is a little bit salty. And so I've got to bleep a couple of things in different spots, but we know that. And then I believe, we have a little training simulator where you have to sit there and run in place, jogging in place, lifting your feet up. Or if you can't do that, there's a little button you can sit there and tap away to your heart's content to run. You're chasing a bad guy down. He runs into a house. You have to figure out, okay, what's all going on around the house. He leaves the house. You have to chase him back down again. And so the whole time you're getting your heart going, you're getting your adrenaline going, and then when you get done, you have a quiz. What did you see here? What did you see here? When the guy dropped something, what did he drop? What was out in front of the house? And when you're doing all of this, the whole purpose here is to help people understand the Marshals is very much, it's a physical job, it's very much a mental job. And as part of this, one of the things that the Marshals actually do in their training in Lincoln, Georgia, at Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, is they train all of the deputies, young men and women who are doing that, some of the most capable young people I've met. They teach them, this is what stresses you out. This is what happens when your heart rate goes up. This is what happens when your adrenaline spikes. And your brain just goes right out of your head. Thoughts and logic goes out of your head. And so you need to be able to think correctly and be able to get through this. And there's different exercise techniques, there's different breathing techniques. And they try to show that to folks here so they can learn that and be able to just understand a little more about the life of a marshal and the job they have. And we are Cherokee Freedmen, the right to citizenship. This is a small temporary exhibit we have. We're going to be having that up through this next January or February, if I remember. Immediately following that, we are going to do a 50th anniversary of the Vietnamese in Fort Smith because the more than 100,000 Vietnamese came to the United States following the Vietnam War in 1975. Every step of the way, Marshals were involved, whether in Guam, out in the Pacific, or at one of 4 different bases here in the United States, including Fort Chaffee. And so we are going to be telling that story this next spring. We have another exhibit that we're going to keep just doing temporary exhibits through this space, and occasionally this space as well as the rest of the building, depending on the time, depending on the budget. If you have some sort of a landmark event you would like to host somewhere, we're the only people in Fort Smith with a view of the Arkansas River. Had a bunch of big flower weddings there, graduations, proms, all kinds of things. But and also, if you ever get down to Fort Smith on the 4th of July, that's one of the best spots to see it from. So, if anybody has any questions whatsoever, I'm not even sure what time we're looking at right now. We have it's what?
It's quarter.
Quarter till, great. I was afraid I was running a little bit closer to the top of the hour. If somebody has a question, I would be more than happy to answer. Because I know that we've got a lot of stuff we do. I ran through a lot of information. And I know there are a number of questions a lot of different people and different audiences have. Everything from our construction to, I don't know, budget questions to the historic flood of 2019 to, I mean, just, there's all kinds of different things. Or specific questions about the marshals. If anybody has a question, I'll be more than happy to answer. Yes, ma'am.
He's first.
Oh, I thought you were raising your hand.
Yeah, I was, but that gentleman is first.
Resources available for people who want to come down and read stuff about ancestors who were the U.S. Marshal. Again, under Parker, you know. It may seem very ordinary, but you know, if it's in your family tree, it matters.
I understand and I empathize completely about that. One part of my job is I'm the supposed to be the font of all knowledge regarding the Marshals history. I'm supposed to be the top subject matter expert in the building. I'm also, as my boss refers to me, I'm the crusher of dreams. We get lots of people who come in that there's a story in their family that somebody in their family wrote for Parker, and I end up. It's about 1 out of 3 times I find out no, they didn't. They actually were doing this, and they got in trouble. But for any inquiries about if you have something in your family, if you're trying to do some genealogical research, by all means, you can contact me through our webpage, or you can contact us through Facebook. I mean, there's a number of ways you can contact the museum with questions. Anything along the lines of genealogy, that ends up coming right to me. Depending on how much time I have and what resources I have available, I can help you out with that. It's surprising to a lot of people, we don't actually, there's no master list. There's no master database. The Marshal Service themselves don't have that list. Partially because of the nature of the organization from up until about the 1950s, there was no real central office. They all answered to the office of the Attorney General, but the Attorney General's records during much that time were even hit and miss, and then sometimes if say a presidential election, because the marshal themselves were presidentially appointed for a period of 4 years, the deputies, they would typically hire themselves. What would end up happening is if there was a presidential election and the party of the president changed from Democrat to Republican or Republican to Democrat, all of that would, all the appointments that start coming out. And the marshal was one of those political jobs. It still is a very political position with a non-political job. They do not respond to politics. They do not, the marshals in any district, they never have ambulances. They're supposed to answer to the politics of the White House. They're supposed to respond to the federal courts and the law. But it's still, it's a political job to get the appointment. They would hire that person would then hire deputies, and every once in a while when the political party would shift, the incoming marshal would make it abundantly clear that they did not want anybody from the old office, so they'd walk into literally an empty office. Some of the records would get to DC, some of the records wouldn't get to DC. A lot of the records that we do have access to ended up staying at the court, specifically in Fort Smith, and those have ended up going to the National Archives. A lot of information is available through Ancestry.com because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, with their work with Ancestry, they have gone through the Fort Worth archives and scanned almost all of the stuff related to the federal court of Fort Smith. So a lot of that's on Ancestry. You can find out a lot of information on newspapers.com. Oddly enough, we're here today for the library presentation. I believe Rutgers has a genealogy department, or do they?
Fort Smith Public Library.
Fort Smith, definitely, yeah. Fort Smith is probably going to be one of your main actually for the subject we're talking about with Fort Smith. If you go through the genealogy department, the library down there, they've got a lot of the same records that we have access to. There's a couple of unofficial lists that we use regularly that are held by just this, it's kind of a proprietary list that the person who originated it does not want to get out, and so we respect his intentions. But if that's usually for us maybe like a starting off point, just to see, well, if they're on that list, they definitely are. If they're not on that list, I may have to do some more work to research it.
I've seen a photocopy of the enrollment form or enlistment form.
It's an oath, yeah, the oath of office.
Where it was signed,
Yes,
so, you know,
that legitimates it right there.
I've seen that much, but I didn't know what other, if I could find other information.
If you have the oath of office for a deputy, that will lead you to the next couple of steps. Those next couple of steps are, my recommendation would be to start going through, Ancestry has the court records for the court at Fort Smith. And so you might be able to find somebody there. The Arkansas State Archives, depending on the time frame, up through about 1893, I believe it is, they have records from the court at Fort Smith, and those are available online. For that, you want to search for the Western District of Arkansas Federal Court. And in that collection, you might, that's going to be very much easier to use, but those are usually the places I go, as well as looking at newspapers.com. Fort Smith Public Library has some different area newspapers that newspapers.com does not have. So you might be able to find some stuff there. But if you know a time frame, if you know when he was doing it, especially based off that oath, you might find his name in the paper, you might find court records. But beyond that, they don't really have, there's people I've talked to who thought that there might be some sort of biographical information about the individuals. Any biographical stuff is something that we had to create based on all these other data points. So, but
What's the Facebook page?
for the Marshals Museum, yeah, you just go to Facebook and search for Marshals Museum, or yeah, just like throw that in your search bar, and Marshals Museum is right there. Otherwise, you can go to our webpage, which is marshalsmuseum.org, and at that will link you to our Facebook, our Twitter, our Instagram. I think we may finally be getting on TikTok, for those of you who do TikTok. Yeah, you can get a hold of us through those. And if there's, and the more information that you can give to us, the more information we might be able to get back. Thank you. No worries. Yes, ma'am.
How important was Judge Parker to the U.S. Marshals?
How important was Judge Parker to the United States Marshals? This is somewhat of a loaded question, and I make people angry every time I answer it. Despite the claims of a lot of historians, despite the claims of a lot of people, especially regarding Bass Reeves, Parker did not hire any marshals. Parker did not hire any deputies. Parker did not hire people unless they were within the court. The marshals, even though they respond to the orders of the court, the marshal themselves is selected by the President of the United States, usually by way of the state of the U.S. senators who represent that district. So if we just sat a brand new U.S. Marshal for the Western District of Arkansas, Fort Smith, his name was submitted to the White House by Senators Bozeman and Cotton because they cover our area. At that time, the U.S. Senators for Arkansas, for the Western District of Arkansas, whoever the U.S. Senators were for Arkansas, would submit those names typically to the White House. Congress would have to approve that. He gets selected. He would then select any of the deputies who work for him in his office staff. Parker's biggest effect in the Western District, the way that he really did positively affect it, is keep in mind, following the American Civil War, the office there was in shambles. It had not been operated for several years, and when it had been operated, it had been operated out of Little Rock, because it was kind of where the district office, they were traveling out to take care of that. With the years following the Civil War, there were a U.S. federal court judge, Judge Story. He almost ended up getting impeached because of different actions that he was taking. Before he could get impeached, he resigned his position, moved to Colorado, got into politics there. The U.S. Marshal and the U.S. Clerk, who were operating in that district, they started a whole scam where they were creating fake posse numbers. So the deputies would get paid for these fake posse members, and they would pay money back to the marshal and the clerk. They were doing some things where, oh yeah, we don't have any money right now, but
here's this piece of paper that's worth this much money, you can take it down to the store downtown and they'll give you 50% on, like 50 cents on the dollar. And then they would split the money with the guy running the store. They had, and that was with 2 deputies who were prior to this. This is during the same time going stank takes place. And so all these bad things are happening at the time. Parker was in the United States House of Representatives from Missouri. He goes in and he's already trying to create an Indian Territory court. He's already trying to do some other legal changes in this region to improve Indian Territory. And he ends up getting, to shut him up, the president says, hey, how would you like to be a U.S. court judge out in Utah? And he goes, how about, can I go down and do Western District of Arkansas? And so he asks for that job, comes down, and because he was so forthright, so earnest in how he wanted to do this and make sure everything was done correct and legally and proper, he set the tone for the rest of that court district for his 20 years. That is the biggest impact that he had, was as much as he was there doing that job and he really didn't have oversight over the marshal's office, the shade that is thrown in some of the letters that he was writing to the U.S. Attorney General's office about who was working at some different point, he was just dragging some of these guys completely. And the marshals in that office, they all had to clean up their act. They all had to do their job. The deputies couldn't screw around. If you were a deputy pulling, like any of us who have seen True Grit, the things that the responder is accused of doing during his job as a deputy, if he was doing any of that stuff under Parker, he would have been charged appropriately under Parker, because Parker would have suggested very heavily to the U.S. Attorney, you need to do something about this guy because he's getting out of hand, and because they would have to throw court cases at him. And as much as Parker is referred to as the hanging judge, it's simply because very few federal court cases, like very few federal crimes, would result in being hanged. And any other district in the country, those judges are not trying those court cases simply because those cases are being tried at the county, city, county, state levels. The federal level, if you're in New York, if you're in Pennsylvania, if you're in Florida, if you're in Georgia, if you're in Arkansas, you're not trying those cases because the city, county, state are trying those cases. Out in Indian Territory, if it involves a U.S. citizen, who's trying those cases? You are. So all of a sudden, so when people start talking about it was almost like he was bloodthirsty, he hated punishment like that. He hated the whole idea of a death sentence. But as with everybody else, this is what's on the books. This is what I have to do. This is what the sentencing guidelines call for. And so that's really where Parker's influence is. It's not as much, it's not a direct, the marshal needs to do this, the deputies need to do that. I don't hire him, don't hire him. It was not that as much as was his was the example. He set the standard that everybody was expected to have.
I have a general question.
Yes, ma'am.
So I was trying to explain to my nephew a little bit about what the marshals are, and I kind of, like you were saying in the beginning, a lot of people think it's True Grit type stuff, and I was kind of saying that, so just ignore that part. But I'm trying to understand, like, where do the marshals fit in along with other federal agencies like the FBI, the ATF, all that? You know, does one have jurisdiction over all the rest, or are they more peers in a way?
Nobody really has, there's no seniority, there's no one person has, like no agency has jurisdiction over other agencies. That all goes to the Attorney General, and from there it comes down. Or in the case, well, ATF used to be under Treasury Department. There's others that fall under different agencies like that. But starting in the early 20th, like prior to the early 20th century, if it was a federal crime, the marshals had all the authority to arrest people for breaking federal law. Starting at the beginning of the 20th century, Department of Treasury, their prohibition people started coming in, basically because Treasury being in prohibition, being more there to take care of tax payments and enforce tax code than anything else, because liquor taxes, that's why we had you go back to thank Alexander Hamilton. For anybody who's seen Hamilton, there's actually a couple of lines in there about him creating excise taxes on alcohol. That's what the whiskey rebellion in Pennsylvania was about. So we can blame Hamilton for that. But they were going out to enforce these liquor laws. They did not have arrest power. So they would take deputies along with them. They're breaking the law. Deputies come in, all right, arrest them, break the stills, do whatever, and then take the bad guys off. As the Department of Prohibition became more permanent, and they started getting agency power, and they started getting arrest power. The Bureau of Investigation, later the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they get created. And statutorily, FBI is given this job, ATF eventually is given this job, Customs is given that, INS, later on, Immigration, Customs Enforcement gets combined, they do this. Everybody has their own little slice of this big pie. The marshals still have the ability to enforce all the laws in the pie. But because these people do all these things, they don't have to worry about that. They get all the spaces in between. As soon as FBI or ATF or somebody else arrests somebody, they then go into the federal court system. That's when the marshals get their hands on them because they're federal prisoners. They have to make sure that they're safe. They get transported back and forth to court. They get transported to prison. The horrible film Con Air, based in reality, but complete work of fiction. An amazing, awesome Jerry Bruckheimer masterpiece of explosions, but there's almost no factual stuff that goes on in there. That's the Marshal Service, transporting prisoners. At the beginning of the film, U.S. Marshals. That's what that is. It's supposed to be a JPATS, Justice Prisoner Alien Transportation Service aircraft, goes down in Illinois. They're transporting prisoners from one prison to different prisons. You've got, as soon as a court case gets finalized, Marshal Service will turn those individuals, if it's a criminal case, they'll turn them over to the prison, or to the correctional facilities wherever they have to go. They will then, if the court said so, whether it is criminal or a civil case, if there is a writ of replevin, R-E-P-L-E-V-I-N, that just basically means we're going to take your stuff. And so my favorite example here is Bernie Madoff, the guy in New York who fleeced all of his investors from a big Ponzi scheme and just ridiculously rich off of it. After he was convicted, the marshals were given a writ of replevin for basically everything he owned. His wife got to keep like the pair of earrings that she was wearing in a wedding ring, some basic clothes. He goes off to prison. Almost everything else that they had was turned over to the marshals and then sold at public auction to raise money to pay for fees, fines, and to pay back the victims of his crimes. They sold everything from houses, apartments, watches, clothing. The guy had more shoes than another Marcos. Cars, boats. I think there was a plane maybe involved. Tchotchkes around the house. Whitey Bulger, the Boston mobster who died a few years back. When he was arrested and they finally took care of all this stuff, one of the things that if I had the money to buy it, I would have. One of the things that came up during his auctions was, because they called him a rat, he had a thing that was a pencil cup that sat on his desk in the shape of a rat that ended up going up for like $800 or $1,000. I wish I could have it. But you can Google Marshall's auction any day of the week, you'll see those. Those come out of asset forfeiture, one of their divisions. Every day in the country, there are fugitive operations going on, trying to catch people who have either escaped prison, didn't show up at federal court. There's no shortage of the jobs that they do. They also, as a result of the Adam Walsh Act, they're responsible for going after people who are responsible for missing and endangered children. And so there's been different rumors over the last few years about saving children or whatever. The marshals are the ones going out after to find out every day on the news. If you follow what the marshals are up to, they're finding a couple kids here, 5 kids there, 10 kids there, 2 kids here. Every day they're finding kids that have been seized by a, say a bad divorce, one of the parents sneaks in and takes 2 of the kids. Or somebody sells their kids, or somebody gets hold of like bring kids into the country and then traffic stuff. The marshals are there to get that. It's a huge, broad swath of the jobs that they do.
Well, that's interesting to know they still have the ability to do all of that, like you said, the whole pie.
And then they still go through and they enforce federal law. If you do a Planned Parenthood clinic, there's going to be definitely marshals because of court cases where they are standing out in front protecting those buildings because of federal injunctions that have been placed against protesters. So, and again, that's, I talked to quite a few deputies who disagree with what goes on inside the building, but they took that, they swore the oath that they're doing the job. So. If you have a question, by all means, feel free to ask me afterwards. You can also go to marshallsmuseum.org. You can go to our Facebook, go to our Instagram. You can ask us questions on any of that stuff. And you can click on the info app, click on the webpage. Otherwise, we're open 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., 7 days a week. We're only closed, I think, 4 days a year, and that's Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving, and Easter. Other than that, we're open. And so but yeah, definitely check our page and see what we're up to, and if you're planning on heading down.
Okay, great, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.